In a rush to sign the divorce papers to be with his mistress, my husband didn't pay attention. My name is Margaret Ellison. And the day my husband pushed the divorce papers across the table, I realized the man I had spent 30 years with wasn't even looking at me anymore. The papers lay between us like a wall. His pen scratched quickly, desperate to move the process forward as though our marriage were a bill he needed to settle before running off to some party. He didn't even pause to look at the clauses, didn't bother to read the fine print. His eyes kept darting to his phone, screen lighting up again and again, with messages I didn't need to read to know who they were from. For a moment, I almost laughed not out of humor, but from the sheer absurdity. 30 years together, 2 children, countless sacrifices, all reduced to a few sheets of paper he wanted to discard in a rush so he could run into the arms of another woman. He didn't even have the decency to pretend. His hand shook as he signed, but not from guilt, from impatience. He was thinking of her. Always her. I watched in silence. That had become my weapon. Silence. I had learned long ago that words, in moments like this, were useless. They bounced off him like pebbles on stone. What cut him deeper was the absence of reaction, the refusal to fight. He thrived on drama, on conflict, on making me the bitter, angry wife, while he played the poor, misunderstood man. But not today. Today I let him believe he was winning. Here, he said shortly, sliding the documents back toward me. His tone was clipped, mechanical. He tapped the table, as if to remind me that my role was done, that I should sign too and release him. His impatience was almost comical, and yet, beneath it, I caught the faint glimmer of arrogance. He believed he had outmaneuvered me. I picked up the papers slowly, deliberately. My fingers smoothed over the crisp edges, but my eyes weren't on the lines he had just signed. I was reading the spaces in between the overlooked clause, the one he hadn't noticed in his rush. My lawyer had advised me months ago. If he's that desperate to leave, Maggie, let him. Desperation makes men sloppy. Let him reveal himself. And reveal himself, he had. I lifted my gaze and studied him. He wasn't even watching me. His attention had already shifted to his phone again, his lips twitching with the faintest smile as another message arrived. I wondered if she was waiting in some cafe, already picturing herself as the new wife, the victor who had won him away from me. The thought didn't sting the way I expected. Instead, it almost calmed me, because the woman who thought she had won had no idea the game she had stepped into. I signed my name, slow and steady, my pen leaving deliberate strokes on the paper, not shaky, not rushed. He might be sprinting toward his new life, but I would walk with measured steps into mine. And unlike him, I knew exactly where I was going. When I pushed the papers back across the table, his relief was visible. His shoulders dropped, his chest expanded in a long exhale. He grinned for the first time that morning, not at me, but at the thought of his freedom. He pocketed his phone, gathered the documents, and rose quickly from his chair. "That's it then," he said, voice light, careless, as if we had just signed off on selling a piece of furniture instead of dissolving 3 decades of a shared life. "I'll let the lawyers finalize it. You'll get the copies." I only nodded. Words weren't necessary. He didn't deserve them. When he left the room, the silence that followed was heavy, but not suffocating. I sat for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me. My hands traced the grain of the wooden table, the same table where we had once celebrated birthdays, where our children had scribbled with crayons, where I had spent nights grading papers while he claimed to be working late. It struck me how many lies this table had witnessed. And yet here it stood, steady, holding the weight of everything. A part of me wanted to crumble, to weep, to rage. But the larger part, the stronger part, refused. Because what he didn't know, what neither he nor his mistress knew, was that in his haste to discard me, he had handed me something far greater than freedom. The clause he hadn't read, the one I had made sure stayed in the agreement, would change everything. And when he discovered it, it would be far too late. But for now, I let the silence embrace me. I let myself feel the sting of betrayal. Not to weaken me, but to remind me. Betrayal sharpens the edges of the soul. It turns patience into steel. And though he believed this was the end, I knew it was only the beginning of a story he had no idea was unfolding. I rose from the chair, smoothed my blouse, and walked toward the window. Outside, the autumn air carried a chill, leaves tumbling across the lawn in a quiet dance. The world moved on, indifferent to my broken marriage, but I felt no despair. I felt something else entirely, a quiet strength, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. He thought he had freed himself, he thought he had won, but I knew better. And soon, so would he. He had always been careless with details. That was his weakness. He relied on charm and speed, on making others believe in the bigger picture, so they wouldn't look too closely at the fine print. It had worked in business, in friendships, in our marriage. But that morning, as his pen raced across the divorce agreement, that same carelessness betrayed him. The clause was buried deep, written in language most people would skim over. A stipulation about the division of assets, drafted carefully by my lawyer after weeks of late-night conversations. He'll never notice, she had said, and she was right, he hadn't. It wasn't malicious trickery, not in the way some might imagine. I hadn't set out to steal from him. I had only insisted on what was fair. The house I had poured my life into, the savings I had protected when he spent recklessly, the inheritance meant for our children. But if he had been patient enough to read, if he had taken even a fraction of the time he gave his mistress's text messages to look at the words on the page, he would have realized he was signing it all away. I thought about that as I sat in the quiet house later that evening. His absence was immediate, almost startling. For years he had filled every corner with his presence, loud footsteps, sharp sighs, the constant hum of his discontent. Now it was just me, the ticking of the clock, and the faint creak of the old floorboards. I poured myself a glass of wine and laid the signed papers out on the dining table. My name beside his, two signatures binding not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of something neither of us could yet see. I traced the clause with my finger, the one line that shifted the balance of everything. He had overlooked it. And in doing so, he had given me what I needed most: security, power, a measure of justice. I imagined the moment he would find out. His smug face crumbling, the mistress's painted smile faltering, when they realized the dream of living lavishly on the spoils of our life together was just that, a dream. They thought I was weak. They thought I would go quietly, humiliated, discarded. But strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, quietly, until the perfect moment to be seen. That night I opened the old photo albums, our children as babies, their wide eyes staring up at me, little hands clutching mine. Family vacations where I was the one behind the camera, capturing him holding them up to the sun as if he were some devoted father. Even then, I remembered. I had seen the cracks. The way his eyes wandered. The way his smile faded as soon as the flash was gone. I closed the album and sat in silence, letting the memories settle. The betrayal had not been sudden. It had been slow, a drip of poison that I had tried to ignore until it consumed everything. But now, at last, the poison was his to drink. The next morning, he came by to pick up a few things. He was all smiles, as if nothing had happened. He spoke casually about moving into a new place, about how this was for the best, about how I would move on quickly. His arrogance was breathtaking. "You didn't even read, did you?" I asked him quietly as he gathered his clothes. He paused, frowning. "What do you mean?" "The agreement." I tilted my head, studying him the way one studies a stranger. "You just signed." He waved his hand dismissively. "The lawyers will sort it out. We both know what belongs to who. There's no need to drag this out." I smiled faintly, but said nothing. It wasn't time yet. Let him believe. Let him bask in the illusion of his new life. The truth would come soon enough. After he left, The house felt lighter. Empty. Yes, but not in the way I feared. It was freedom. Every echo, every shadow was mine now. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories, and I realized that what remained wasn't just a house, it was the life I had built with my own hands. And thanks to his carelessness, it was mine to keep. I thought of the mistress. Did she know he had left her with nothing but debts and hollow promises? Or did she still believe she was stepping into wealth and comfort? Into the life of a man who had provided everything. I almost pitied her. Almost. But then, I remembered her laughter in the background of his phone calls, the way she had paraded herself in town once the whispers began. Number pity was wasted on her. She had chosen her role in this story, and soon she would realize the cost of that choice. As for me, I chose silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of patience. The kind that watches, waits, and knows exactly when to speak. Because one day, very soon, he would discover the truth, hidden in his own signature. And when he did, it wouldn't be anger that destroyed him. It would be the realization that he had done it to himself. And I would be there, watching quietly when it happened. For months, maybe even years, I had sensed her shadow in my marriage. The woman behind the texts, the laughter that slipped through phone calls, the perfume that lingered faintly on his jacket when he came home late. At first, I told myself it was nothing. That denial was easier than facing the truth. But deep down, I knew. Wives always know. It's not the obvious things that betray a man. It's the small, quiet shifts, the way his voice softened when he answered certain calls, the way his hair was suddenly trimmed more neatly, the new shirts that appeared in his closet without explanation. He started humming again, something he hadn't done in years. I knew it wasn't because of me. The mistress was everywhere, without ever being in the room. She wore a mask, of course the mask of secrecy, of pretending she wasn't breaking a family. But I had glimpsed behind it in the careless moments, like the night he came home smelling of roses in December, when no such roses bloomed near us. Or the time he slipped and called me darling in a tone that wasn't his, a borrowed softness he never used with me. I didn't confront him then. What good would it have done? He would have denied it, twisted the truth, until I was the jealous, paranoid wife. That was his gift manipulation, dressed as charm. Instead, I watched. I listened, and slowly, I began to see the entire picture. She wasn't young, not in the way one might assume. She was polished, careful, the kind of woman who studied her reflection too long before stepping into the world. I had seen her once, though he didn't know. She was leaving a cafe in town, walking quickly toward a car I recognized as his. Her hand brushed his sleeve in a gesture too intimate to mistake. She laughed a laugh that rang sharp, almost rehearsed. That was when I knew for certain. The mask of betrayal is never perfect. It always cracks if you look closely enough. I remember going home that day, standing in front of the mirror, and staring at myself for a long time. Lines had formed around my eyes, proof of years spent smiling through pain, of nights spent worrying over bills, children, his moods. My hair had thinned slightly. My hands bore the marks of age. And yet, I didn't feel defeated. I felt steady, grounded. She could paint her lips red and wrap herself in silk, but she didn't know him like I did. She didn't know the weight of his temper, the selfishness that always lurked beneath his gestures. She saw only the mask he showed her, the charming man who made promises. Let her believe in it. It was almost a relief when he stopped pretending. When his phone calls became too frequent to hide. When his absences stretched into nights. When he grew restless in the very home we had built together. By then, I had already stopped fighting for his love. What I fought for instead was my dignity and my children's future. The night before he asked for a divorce, I caught him standing in the hallway with his suitcase. He looked at me as if weighing whether to speak or not. His lips parted, then closed again. Finally, He muttered something about being done with the charade. It was almost laughable, as though I had been the one pretending all along. I said nothing. My silence unnerved him more than any accusation could have. He wanted me to explode, to sob, to demand explanations. He wanted me to confirm the narrative he'd been crafting for himself and for her, that I was the bitter, hysterical wife. Instead, I gave him nothing. Just a calm nod and a quiet retreat into the bedroom. Because I already knew what he didn't. That in his haste to discard me, he had set the stage for his own undoing. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what she thought of me. Did she picture me as fragile, clinging, a woman too weak to let go? Did he paint me as cold, ungrateful, the reason he had no choice but to find someone else? The thought used to gnaw at me, but now, it only fueled me. Because she would one day learn that the woman she mocked in her mind was far stronger than she could ever imagine. When the papers were signed, when his hand trembled from eagerness to be hers, I thought of her again. Did she know what he had just done? Did she realize that his impatience had cost them both the comfort they believed awaited? The mask of betrayal may deceive for a time, but it always slips. Hers would too. And when it did, I would not need to gloat. My victory would not come from humiliating her or shouting at him. My victory would come from watching them unravel under the weight of their own choices. For now, though, I remained silent. I folded the papers neatly, slid them into their envelope, and placed them in the drawer where I kept important documents. I let the house return to stillness. But inside me, something stirred. Not grief, not even rage. It was a quiet fire, burning steady, waiting. Because betrayal had broken something in me, yes. But it had also awakened something far more powerful. Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. The morning after the papers were signed, I walked through the house as if I were seeing it for the first time. Every corner carried a piece of me, my fingerprints pressed into the walls of this life I had built. The curtains I had sewn years ago, when we couldn't afford new ones, still hanging in the living room. The scuffed wooden banister where our children once slid down laughing. The smell of old books in the study, stacked in piles I had arranged during long nights while he was away on business. I had held this house together like glue. And for what? For a man who now ran into the arms of another woman, pretending 30 years of sacrifice had been nothing more than a phase he'd outgrown. I sat on the edge of the bed we had shared, running my hands over the quilt. I had stitched it myself in my 30s. Every square made from old shirts and dresses we no longer used. Each piece told a story. The blue from his work shirt, the red from my favorite summer dress, the green from a set of curtains I'd once made for our daughter's room. I remembered staying up late to finish it while he complained that my sewing machine kept him awake. I should have known then my love was work, stitching together fragments to create warmth, while his love was always conditional. People say resentment builds like rust. It creeps in slowly, quietly, until one day the whole structure is corroded. That's what our marriage had become. For years, I ignored the signs. I told myself that every family had struggles, that all husbands grew distant after decades, that my role was to hold things steady. I smiled through anniversaries where his eyes wandered elsewhere. I cooked meals he barely touched. I raised children while he raised his voice. And yet, through it all, I carried the weight. I supported his career when he wanted to start his business, even when it meant I had to take extra shifts at the school. I managed the bills when his investments failed. I kept the children calm when his temper flared. I was the anchor, the quiet force that held it all together while he strutted around as if he were the hero of our story. What hurt wasn't just his betrayal with another woman, it was the betrayal of everything I had given up for him. The nights I went without sleep to finish grading papers after helping him prepare a presentation. The vacations I never took, so we could save money for his projects. The dreams I folded away, like fragile letters in a drawer because his ambitions always came first. I remembered one evening in particular. Our son was 10, our daughter 7. The children had been rehearsing a play in the living room, laughing and stumbling through their lines. I had begged him to watch, just for a few minutes. But he stood by the door, coat in hand, saying he had more important things to do. I told him one day he'd regret it. He only smirked and left. That memory burned even now, sharper than the discovery of his mistress. Because betrayal doesn't begin with another woman, it begins with all the small ways a man turns his back on his family long before. As I sat there in the quiet, I realized something. I wasn't mourning the end of a marriage that had died long ago. What I mourned was the years I had lost, the woman I could have been if I hadn't poured myself into holding up a man who never truly saw me. But bitterness was not my destiny. That was the difference. I would not let his betrayal turn me into a ghost of myself. I had already lived too many years in his shadow. Now it was my turn to step into the light, even if that light came from the fire of destruction. When I looked at the divorce papers again, I didn't see an ending. I saw 30 years of my labor finally being acknowledged, not by him, but by fate. By the oversight he had made in his reckless haste. That clause was more than legal language. It was a symbol. A quiet recognition of everything I had built. Everything I had earned. Everything I had been denied. I whispered to myself as I folded the papers and placed them back in the drawer. This is mine. Finally, this is mine. Later that afternoon, I stepped into the garden. The autumn air bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. The roses had withered, their petals scattered across the soil, but the roots remained strong. I knelt, pressing my hands into the earth, and felt the pulse of life beneath my palms. This garden was mine too. Every bloom, every thorn. I had planted it, nurtured it, protected it, just like I had done with our life. Except this time, the harvest was mine to keep. As I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands, I thought about the years ahead. For the first time in decades, I could imagine a future not tethered to his moods or his ambitions. A future where my sacrifices weren't wasted, where my efforts bore fruit that no one could take from me. I turned toward the house, its windows glowing faintly in the late afternoon sun. It wasn't perfect. No house, no life ever is. But it was mine. Every brick, every memory, every scar. And no mistress, no careless man, could sign that away from me now. I let out a long breath, one that carried years of weight I hadn't even known I was holding. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. It's strange how people always know more than they say. For months, I had walked through my days as if everything were normal, keeping up appearances, smiling politely at neighbors, pretending not to notice the widening cracks in my marriage. But the world around me had already noticed. They always do. It started with whispers, small, almost invisible threads of truth woven into casual conversations. At the grocery store, Mrs. Thompson, the widow from 2 blocks down, leaned over her cart and said with an arched brow, "I saw your husband in town the other day. He looked happy. Nice to see him smiling again." Her words carried no malice, but the implication was sharp. I hadn't seen him smile like that in years, certainly not with me. At the school, one of my colleagues hesitated before asking if I was doing all right. When I pressed, she glanced away and mumbled something about having seen him at a restaurant. He wasn't alone, she added, then quickly excused herself, as though the words had slipped out by accident. It was always like that. Half sentences, lingering looks, pity disguised as politeness, and I understood. They didn't want to tell me outright, but they wanted me to know. Maybe they thought I was blind. Maybe they thought it was kinder to let me piece it together myself. The worst was at a birthday party for one of our neighbors. My husband hadn't come. Of course, he always had an excuse. I was standing by the punch bowl when I overheard 2 women whispering behind me. "She looks so composed. Do you think she knows?" "She must. Everyone else does. He's not exactly discreet." Their words stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I didn't already suspect, but because of the humiliation. To be the last one to know. To be the wife standing in the middle of a crowd, smiling through the knowledge that everyone else could see the betrayal written in the lines of my life. But I held my composure. I always did. I smiled politely, raised my glass, and made small talk with the rest. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. When I went home that night, though, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at myself until tears finally came. Not for him, not anymore. For me, for the years I had spent pretending everything was fine, for the dignity I had to claw back from the gossip swirling around me. Still, the whispers served a purpose. They hardened me. Each one was like a needle stitching resolve into my skin. If he thought he could humiliate me publicly, flaunt his affair so carelessly, then he had underestimated me far more than I realized. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend, Claire, who had known us since the children were small. We sat at a cafe, sipping tea, the air thick with words she clearly wanted to say but didn't know how. Finally, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Maggie," she said softly, "you don't deserve any of this. He's making a fool of himself, and of her." The relief I felt in that moment nearly undid me. Someone had said it aloud. Someone had acknowledged the truth, without hiding it behind polite vagueness. I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled a small, tired smile, and whispered, "I know." She looked surprised, then almost proud. "Then you'll be fine," she said firmly. "You've always been stronger than he realized." Her words stayed with me long after I left the cafe. Stronger than he realized. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? He had spent decades convincing himself that I was fragile, dependent, easily discarded. He thought I would crumble without him. He thought I would beg. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes silence is just strategy. The whispers around town didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder after he moved out. People spoke of seeing him at dinners, holding hands across a table, laughing too loudly as if to prove his happiness. The mistress was no longer a shadow. She was stepping into the open, parading herself without shame. And yet, with every whisper, with every sideways glance, I felt something shifting inside me. Their pity no longer cut me down. It fueled me. Because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know about the papers he had rushed to sign. They didn't know about the clause he had missed. They thought I was the abandoned wife, quietly enduring her humiliation. But I knew the truth. The world might see me as pitiful now, but soon, when the dust settled, it would be him they pitied. Late at night, when the whispers echoed too loudly in my mind, I would sit by the fire and remind myself, patience. Let them laugh now. Let them whisper. Every story has its turning point. And mine was coming. It's one thing to hear whispers. It's another to find proof staring back at you in your own home. For a long time, I told myself I didn't need evidence. I already knew. A wife always knows. But the universe has a cruel way of forcing the truth into the open, laying it out so starkly you can no longer pretend. It began with a receipt. He had come home in a rush one evening, tossing his jacket over the back of a chair, like he always did. Hours later, after he had stormed off to bed, I gathered his things, as I always had old habits die slowly, even when your heart is bruised. That's when I found it, crumpled in the pocket. A receipt from a restaurant 2 towns over. Dinner for 2. A bottle of wine far more expensive than anything he had ever ordered when dining with me. And the date our wedding anniversary. I sat there at the kitchen table holding that slip of paper in my hand, my fingers trembling. The anniversary he had forgotten, claiming he was busy with a meeting. All along he had been celebrating. Just not with me. A few days later, I found something else. A lipstick-stained napkin stuffed into the glove compartment of his car. It was bold, almost taunting, as if she wanted me to find it. As if she were marking her territory. And then came the photograph. It was tucked into the back of his briefcase, half hidden among contracts and financial statements. A candid shot him with her at a hotel lounge, his hand on her waist, her head tilted back in laughter. They looked like a couple on holiday, carefree and radiant. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt the air leave my lungs, as though I had been punched. That was the moment the whispers turned into certainty. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't half-heard gossip or lingering perfume. It was proof, solid, undeniable proof that the life I thought I had been living was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. I could have confronted him then. I could have hurled the receipt, the napkin, the photograph at him, and demanded answers. But I didn't. I folded them away carefully, storing them like weapons I might one day need. Evidence not for him, but for me. A reminder that my instincts had been right all along. A reminder that I was not crazy, not paranoid, not imagining shadows. He had done this, and he had been careless enough to leave the trail behind. That night, I sat alone at the dining table with the evidence spread before me. The house was silent, the clock ticking on the wall, the wine glass half empty in my hand. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger. A woman hardened by betrayal, a woman who had been forced to face the truth. And yet, beneath the grief, there was something else. A strange, steady calm. Because as painful as the proof was, it also gave me clarity. I no longer had to question myself. I no longer had to wonder if I was imagining things. The truth was there, written in receipts and lipstick, captured in photographs. And the truth had a way of setting me free. The next morning, he stumbled into the kitchen, grumbling about work. He didn't notice the way I looked at him. He didn't see the quiet steel in my eyes. He kissed me on the cheek out of habit, distracted, already reaching for his phone. I stood there watching him, and all I could think was, "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." Later, as I folded laundry, another thought struck me. How sloppy he had become. How reckless. He had been so desperate to chase this woman, so hungry for the thrill, that he had stopped covering his tracks. It wasn't just arrogance, it was carelessness. And carelessness, I knew, always comes with a price. I began to collect the pieces, not out of obsession, but out of resolve. Every receipt, every note, every trace of her I found, I tucked away in a drawer. It wasn't revenge I was after, not yet. It was preparation. Because when the time came, I wanted to be ready. One evening, as I was gathering laundry, I found a scarf that wasn't mine tangled among his clothes. Expensive. Silk. Still carrying the faint scent of her perfume. I held it up to my face and breathed it in, not out of longing but out of memorization. To know the scent of the woman who thought she could take my place. I folded it neatly and placed it with the rest of the evidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. The story he thought he had hidden became clearer every day. And with each discovery, my resolve grew stronger. Because I knew this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about dignity. About years of sacrifice dismissed with the flick of his pen. About a life I had built being tossed aside as if it meant nothing. And if he thought I would let that stand, he had underestimated me gravely. That night, as I sat alone with the drawer of secrets I had gathered, I whispered to myself, patience. Patience had always been my gift, and now, it would be my weapon. There comes a moment when the weight of betrayal presses so heavily on your chest that you think you might suffocate. For me, that moment came late one night, sitting on the bedroom floor with the drawer of evidence spilled out around me. Receipts, photographs, lipstick-stained napkins, the scarf that wasn't mine, each piece cutting deeper than the last. I pressed my face into my hands and let the sobs come. Silent, but violent. Shaking my entire body. I had been strong for so long, had swallowed so much silence, that it felt like I was choking on it. For 30 years, I had carried the burden of his moods, his failures, his neglect. And now I had to carry his betrayal too. For hours I stayed there, tears soaking through my sleeves, chest aching with the kind of grief that feels like it will never end. But then something strange happened. As dawn began to creep through the curtains, a kind of clarity settled over me. My sobs slowed, then stopped. My breathing steadied, and the tears dried, leaving my face stiff with salt. I looked at the evidence again, not as a woman broken, but as a woman awakened. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't the end of me. It was the end of him. Grief shifted into anger. Anger hardened into resolve. I would not beg. I would not collapse. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me undone. Number. If he thought he could discard me like a worn-out coat, he was mistaken. I remembered something my mother once told me when I was a girl. When people show you who they are, don't argue. Don't try to change them. Just learn and prepare. I had prepared my entire life without even realizing it. I had learned his weaknesses, his habits, his arrogance. And now, I would use them. I began to plan. It started simply. I organized the evidence, placing each piece in a neat folder. Receipts in one, photographs in another, personal items in a box. I labeled everything carefully, like a teacher preparing lesson plans. The methodical act soothed me. It wasn't about confronting him immediately, it was about being ready when the time came. Then I reviewed the divorce papers again, tracing the clause he had overlooked. That single sentence was more powerful than any confrontation. With it, I held control. He didn't even know it yet. I thought about confronting the mistress, showing her the evidence, tearing down her illusion. But no, that would be too easy. Too messy. No, I would let time do the work. Let her discover the truth not from me, but from the very man she had pinned her hopes on. The more I thought, the clearer it became. My power was in patience, in silence, in letting him walk blindly into his own undoing. For weeks, I said nothing. I moved through my days as though nothing had changed. I went to the grocery store, graded my students' essays, met with friends for coffee. I let the whispers continue. Let people believe I was the pitiful, discarded wife. But inside, a storm was building. At night, while he slept elsewhere, I walked through the house and reclaimed it as my own. I touched the walls, rearranged the furniture, lit candles in every room. This was my space now. Mine. And though he thought he had taken everything from me, he had, in truth, given me freedom. But freedom without justice is hollow. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I pictured the moment he would realize the truth, the way his face would harden, the way his arrogance would crumble. I pictured him running back to the mistress with excuses, and her turning on him when she saw the reality. It wasn't revenge. I craved not in the dramatic sense. It was justice. A balancing of the scales. I had given him 3 decades. Now, finally, I would take something back. The breaking point had come, but instead of shattering me, it forged me. I was steel now, tempered by betrayal, and he didn't even know it. When I looked at myself in the mirror that night, I saw someone new. The lines on my face were still there. The weariness in my eyes hadn't vanished. But there was something different. A firmness in my jaw, a steadiness in my gaze. I wasn't the same woman who had once begged for his attention, who had once wept into pillows wondering what I had done wrong. I knew now. I had done nothing wrong. He had chosen betrayal. He had chosen lies. And soon, he would learn what it meant to underestimate me. I whispered it aloud, a vow to myself as much as to the universe. I won't be silent forever. And in that vow, I found my strength. The strangest thing about betrayal is how ordinary life can seem, while everything underneath is rotting. My husband carried himself as if nothing had changed. He still walked into rooms with that same brisk confidence, still spoke to people with the easy charm that once captivated me. He didn't even realize how transparent he had become, how every word, every glance, revealed more than he intended. And I let him. I became his silent audience, watching as he spun his web tighter and tighter, never noticing the strands that would soon strangle him. One evening, he stopped by the house to pick up more of his belongings. He breezed through the front door, as if he still owned the place, tossing his keys onto the counter, humming a tune. The arrogance of it almost made me laugh. "How are you holding up?" he asked casually, like a neighbor checking in after a storm. "I'm fine," I said evenly. He glanced around the house, his eyes landing on the family photos still hanging on the wall. For a moment, his expression flickered a shadow of guilt, perhaps, or maybe just irritation that I hadn't torn everything down in some dramatic fit. But the moment passed quickly. "You should get rid of those," he said, nodding at the pictures. "No sense in clinging to the past." I tilted my head, studying him. "Is that what you're doing? Not clinging?" He smirked. "I'm moving on. You should too." "Weh." I didn't answer. Silence unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. He shifted uncomfortably, then changed the subject, rambling about his new place, about how fresh everything felt, about how she had a way of making things exciting again. I listened, nodding occasionally, as though I were interested. Inside, though, I was cataloging every word, every boast. He wanted me to know about her. He wanted to see if I would break. What he didn't realize was that every careless confession only tightened the rope he was wrapping around his own neck. When he finally left that night, I stood by the window and watched him drive away. His car disappeared down the street, taillights fading into the dark. I felt no sadness, only a calm, steady certainty. He was walking deeper into his own trap, and all I had to do was let him. Days turned into weeks. I heard things through the grapevine, the expensive dinners, the weekend getaways, the way he flaunted her, as though he had won some great prize. People whispered, of course. They always whisper. But I didn't mind. Let them think what they wanted. Let them pity me now. They'd see the truth soon enough. One afternoon, I went into town for groceries. As I walked past a cafe, I saw them together. They were sitting at a corner table, his hand over hers, his laughter loud enough to turn heads. She leaned in close, whispering something that made him grin like a schoolboy. For a brief second, our eyes met. He froze, caught mid-laugh, his expression stiffening into something awkward, almost guilty. She turned to see what had silenced him, and followed his gaze. Her lips curled into a smug smile when she saw me. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply adjusted the bag on my shoulder and kept walking, my head high, my steps steady. Behind me, I could feel his eyes burning into my back, but I never turned around. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the fire, thinking of that encounter. I wondered if he'd lie to her about me, if he'd paint me as bitter and broken, the discarded wife he had bravely escaped. Let him. Let her believe she had triumphed. Every false narrative he spun would only make the truth more devastating when it finally came crashing down. I thought again of the divorce papers, of his rushed signature scrawled across the page. He had no idea what he had agreed to. No idea that the very thing he believed set him free had bound him tighter than ever. It was almost poetic. His arrogance had blinded him, made him careless, made him reckless. He was so eager to prove himself, to flaunt his new life, that he hadn't stopped to consider what he was leaving behind. And I didn't need to stop him. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to wait. Patience became my companion. I went about my life, tending to the garden, teaching my students, meeting friends for coffee. On the surface, I was the woman everyone pitied, quiet, dignified, enduring. But beneath the surface, I was something else entirely. The woman who held the final card. Sometimes, at night, I would picture the moment he would discover the truth. I imagined the look on his face, the anger, the disbelief, the helpless rage when he realized what his own carelessness had cost him. I pictured the mistress's reaction too, her smug smile dissolving into horror as she realized the dream she had chased was built on sand. And in those moments, I felt something close to peace. Because the best revenge, I realized, wasn't in striking back. It was in letting him destroy himself. And that was exactly what he was doing. All this time, he thought he had won. He strutted around town with her on his arm, head high, chest puffed, as though leaving me had crowned him king of some new kingdom. But kings who rise too quickly often forget to read the laws of the land they claim to rule. And my husband, in his desperate rush to sign those divorce papers, had ignored the law that would undo him. You see, the agreement he signed wasn't just a simple division of property. It was meticulous, drawn up with the care of someone who had been preparing for this moment long before he realized it. Hidden among the ordinary language, beneath the legal jargon he never bothered to skim, was a clause. One line that shifted the balance of power entirely. It stated that the family home, the savings accounts, and the inheritance left by my parents, everything of true value, would remain under my name. His signature, scribbled in haste, sealed it. He hadn't read it, he hadn't asked. He had simply signed, his eyes too busy flicking toward his phone, too eager to run into her arms. And that was the mistake that would cost him everything. I remember the moment my lawyer slid the final draft across her polished oak desk. She looked at me with sharp eyes and said, "If he's rushing, let him rush." Men blinded by desire never noticed the ground crumbling under their feet. I nodded then, though I hadn't fully believed her. But now, watching him flaunt his supposed freedom, I understood. His arrogance had been my shield. His carelessness, my salvation. Sometimes I sit by the window at night, the papers locked safely in my drawer, and imagine the day he will realize. The day the bills start piling up. The day she asks him where the promised wealth has gone. The day he confronts me in fury only to discover his own signature betrays him. I don't plan to shout. I don't plan to gloat. I will simply hold up the paper, point to the line, and let him read his undoing with his own eyes. That will be enough. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, the quietest revelations are the most devastating. When friends look at me with pity now, I almost want to laugh. They see a woman discarded, abandoned, humiliated. They whisper about how brave I am, how composed I remain. If only they knew the truth. If only they knew that I am not the one left empty-handed. He is. And as for her? The mistress who smiles smugly when she sees me in town. The woman who believes she has replaced me. I let her smile. Because her smile is built on ignorance. And ignorance never lasts. One day, she will wake up and realize she isn't sharing her life with a man of wealth, but with a man who has given away his stability, his home, his future. She will realize the only thing he truly offered her was his lies. And when that day comes, I won't need to lift a finger. She will despise him on her own. That is the beauty of silence. It doesn't just protect you, it exposes them. Sometimes, late at night, I ask myself if I am cruel for waiting like this. If it makes me cold to let him walk into a disaster I could warn him about. But then I remember all the nights I spent alone while he lied. All the sacrifices I made while he took. All the times he could have chosen kindness, but instead chose betrayal. No, I am not cruel. I am simply done carrying the weight of his choices. He will carry them now. The irony is that he thinks I am powerless. He thinks I am clinging to scraps, a woman too weak to move on. And yet, all the while, the truth sits in my drawer, waiting. How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? He paraded her around town, as if she were a trophy. The mistress, younger in spirit, if not in years, dressed in clothes that shimmered just enough to draw attention, clung to his arm with the smug smile of a woman who believed she had won. And he, foolish man that he was, seemed to thrive on the spectacle. They went to the nicest restaurants, laughing loudly at corner tables where they knew they'd be seen. They booked weekend trips to resorts nearby, snapping photos in lobbies with marble floors and golden chandeliers. And everywhere they went, people noticed. That was what he wanted to be noticed. To show the world that he was happy, liberated, reborn. What he didn't realize was that every display of triumph only deepened the irony, because the life he thought he was flaunting wasn't his anymore. One afternoon, as I walked through town, I saw them outside a boutique. She was holding up a handbag, her eyes gleaming, while he stood beside her, puffing out his chest like a proud benefactor. He paid for it, of course, handing over his credit card with a flourish. But I knew better. I knew his accounts were thinning, his debts already mounting. The clause he had overlooked was quietly at work, cutting away the illusion piece by piece. From across the street, I watched as she kissed him on the cheek, her lipstick leaving a bold mark. He didn't notice me, or perhaps he pretended not to. Either way, I kept walking, my steps steady. Let him enjoy his show. The curtain would fall soon enough. At night, I would hear from friends whispers about the dinners, the shopping sprees, the way they spoke openly of plans for the future. "They're talking about marriage," one neighbor told me, her eyes wide with a mix of pity and disbelief. I smiled faintly, keeping my secret to myself. Let them talk. Let them dream. Because I knew what was coming. The mistress believed she had stepped into comfort, that she had secured a man who would give her everything. But what she didn't realize was that he had already signed away his security. The house she thought she would one day redecorate in her style was mine. The savings she believed would fund her luxuries were locked under my name. And the inheritance she dreamed of sharing was out of his reach forever. It was almost cruel letting them build castles out of sand. But it wasn't my cruelty, it was his. He had laid the foundation on lies, and now they were decorating the walls with vanity and pride. One evening, as I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, I pictured them dining together. He would be telling her stories, painting himself as the victim of a cold, unloving wife. She would laugh, her hand brushing his arm, assuring him he deserved better. And he would believe her, soaking in the adoration he had craved for years. I wondered if he ever thought of me in those moments. If he ever felt even a flicker of guilt. But I doubted it. Men like him rarely look back. They only see what they want to see. Still, his arrogance made him sloppy. Bills began to arrive at the house, credit cards overdrawn, notices from lenders. I forwarded them to his new address without comment. I didn't need to add words. The numbers spoke loudly enough. And then came the whispers of trouble. A friend of a friend mentioned that the new apartment wasn't as glamorous as he made it seem, that she was already frustrated with the bills piling up, with his promises stretching thin, that their laughter in public masked arguments in private. I listened quietly, never reacting, but inside I felt the smallest spark of satisfaction. Not because I wanted her misery, but because it meant the mask was slipping. And once the mask slips, the whole performance begins to unravel. Still, I remained patient. I didn't rush to expose him. I didn't shove the papers in his face or announce my victory. No, I let him flaunt his illusions. I let him believe he had won, because every day he believed it, every day he paraded her in front of the world, only made the fall that much greater. Sometimes, I would catch my reflection in the window as I sat alone in the evenings. The woman staring back at me wasn't pitiful. She wasn't broken. She was steady, calm, waiting. And I realized something important. I didn't need to chase revenge. I didn't need to scream or destroy. I only needed to stand still and let him destroy himself. And he was doing it beautifully. The unraveling didn't come all at once. It was slow, deliberate, almost merciful in its pace. Though mercy had nothing to do with it. It was simply consequence, catching up to arrogance. The first sign arrived in the mail. A thin white envelope stamped with red. Overdue. His name glared up at me. The ink heavy. The words undeniable. I set it aside, forwarding it to his new address without comment. It wasn't my debt to pay, not anymore. Then came another, and another. Credit cards, personal loans, even a notice from a contractor he had stiffed years ago. One by one, they piled up. And one by one, I slipped them into new envelopes and sent them along. I imagined the scene each time he opened one. The crease in his brow, the way his smug smile would falter, the way she would look at him first with confusion, then with irritation, and finally, with the dawning realization that the life she had dreamed of wasn't what she thought. For years, I had been the one to keep the books balanced, to stretch every dollar, to save when he spent recklessly. He had called me frugal, accused me of lacking vision. He wanted luxury, attention, excess. I wanted stability. And now, in the most ironic of turns, my carefulness was my salvation, and his carelessness was his downfall. Meanwhile, my own life was calm. The clause he had overlooked protected me. The house was secure, the savings untouched. I slept at night without fear of eviction, without wondering how to pay the bills. My life, once tethered to his chaos, finally felt steady. One evening, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She leaned in, her voice low, eyes glinting with the thrill of gossip. "Have you heard?" she whispered. "He's struggling. People say he's drowning in debt. She's not happy." I smiled politely, shaking my head as if I didn't know, as if I hadn't guessed. But inside, I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice unfolding. Not because I wished him suffering, I had long since let go of that desire, but because I had lived too many years cleaning up his messes. It was his turn now. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had traded 30 years of stability for the fleeting excitement of passion, only to find himself buried in the very chaos he once left for me to manage. And I had finally found peace. At night, I would sit in the living room with a book and a cup of tea, the fire crackling softly. I listened to the silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness, but the gentle quiet of freedom, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand, doesn't accuse, doesn't betray. Sometimes, though, my thoughts wandered to her. The mistress. I pictured her sitting across from him at their new apartment, arms crossed, lips tight, her eyes narrowed with disappointment. She had thought she was inheriting wealth, comfort, security. Instead, she was discovering what I had known for years, that he was reckless, selfish, incapable of sustaining the illusions he so desperately clung to. It must have been a bitter realization, watching the bills pile up, the promises crumble, the glamour fade into the harsh light of reality. And yet, I didn't pity her. She had chosen him. She had stepped into the role willingly, mocking me, with her smug smiles, believing she had stolen something valuable. Let her learn now, as I had learned long ago, that some men offer only emptiness, disguised as charm. One morning, as I tended the garden, I saw him pull up in his car. He looked older, worn. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his shoulders less proud. He came to the door with a folder in his hand. Bills, no doubt. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tight. I stepped aside, letting him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once rushed through the divorce papers, and spread the folder open. Overdue notices, final warnings, credit balances in red. "They're draining me," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Everything's slipping." I sipped my tea, watching him carefully. "That sounds difficult." He looked up at me, irritation flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand." But I did. I understood perfectly. For decades, I had been the one to manage the chaos, to shield him from consequences. He had thrown that away the moment he chose her. And now, here he sat, facing the reality of his own choices. I offered no solutions, no sympathy, only silence. He gathered the papers back into the folder, his hands trembling slightly. I just need some time. Things will turn around. I almost laughed. Time. As if time could fix arrogance. As if time could erase carelessness. No, time only revealed the truth. When he left, I closed the door and stood in the quiet kitchen. I looked around at the house, at the walls I had built and protected, and I felt the weight of relief. This was mine. Secure. Safe. His chayas no longer touched me. And for the first time in years, I realized something profound. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. It was inevitable. I had known from the moment he scribbled his name across those papers that the day would come when realization struck him like a hammer. The only question had been when. It happened on a gray afternoon. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air damp with the smell of rain. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, when I heard the pounding on the door. Not a knock. A pounding, angry, frantic, the sound of a man who had run out of patience. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it to find him standing there, his face flushed, his hair damp with sweat despite the chill. He held a crumpled set of papers in one hand, the divorce agreement. You knew, he spat before I could even speak. I said nothing, only stepped aside and let him storm into the kitchen. He slammed the papers onto the table, the same table where he had once signed them so carelessly. His finger jabbed at the clause. The clause. This, he shouted. You set me up. You tricked me. I looked down at the words. Calm. Steady. My heart strangely quiet. I didn't trick you. You signed it yourself. You hid it. His voice was hoarse, trembling with fury. You buried it in the fine print so I wouldn't notice. I met his eyes, my tone level. Number I placed it in plain sight. You didn't bother to read. You were too busy rushing toward her. His jaw clenched. He paced back and forth, fists tight at his sides. The house, the accounts, the inheritance, all of it. You knew what this would do to me. I folded my arms, leaning back against the counter. I knew what it would do to me if I didn't. 30 years of sacrifice, of cleaning up your mistakes, of being dismissed like a servant, and you thought you could walk away and leave me with nothing? Number I protected myself. Oh, for a moment, the anger in his eyes faltered, replaced by something raw panic. He sank into a chair, burying his head in his hands. She doesn't know, he muttered. She thinks I still have everything. I almost pitied him then. Almost. You made your choice, I said softly. You chose her. You chose to leave. But you don't get to rewrite the past or erase what I built. His head snapped up, eyes blazing. This isn't over. I'll fight it. I'll take you to court. I raised a hand, cutting him off. Go ahead. Try. But every signature, every clause, every word has been reviewed and filed. You can fight, but you'll only waste what little you have left. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock. He looked at me then as if seeing me for the first time, not the quiet, compliant wife he had thought I was, but the woman who had outlasted him, who had turned his own arrogance into his downfall. You always were colder than I thought, he whispered bitterly. I smiled faintly. Number. Not cold. Just done being blind. He rose suddenly, grabbing the papers in a fist, crumpling them as though destroying the physical pages could erase what they represented. His hands trembled, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. She'll leave me, he said hoarsely, almost to himself. When she finds out, she'll leave me. I didn't respond. There was no need. We both knew it was true. He glared at me one last time, then stormed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back, his voice sharp with venom. You'll regret this. I held his gaze, unflinching. Number, I think. For once. I won't. The door slammed. the sound echoing through the house. I stood there in the kitchen, the dough half kneaded on the counter, the air still vibrating with his rage. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from release. The storm had come and gone, and I was still standing. I sat at the table, smoothing the crumpled papers he had left behind. My name beside his, the ink permanent, unchangeable. His fury could not erase the truth. He had undone himself. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. I watched it, listening to the rhythm, and felt something I hadn't in years. A sense of closure. He had thought I was powerless. He had thought I would collapse under the weight of his betrayal. But instead, I had endured. And now, I had won. After he stormed out, the house fell into silence again. Not the suffocating silence of loneliness that used to weigh on me, but a new kind. Lighter. Almost comforting. I stood at the window and watched the rain cascade down the glass, each droplet streaking its own path, like a reminder that life always finds a way to move forward. For 30 years, I had carried the burden of his choices, his failures, his betrayals. I had bent myself into shapes to accommodate his pride, his hunger, his endless need for admiration. And in the end, he had discarded me with the same haste he used to sign his name on those papers. But the irony was that in his rush to leave, he had given me everything I needed to stand tall. The house, the savings, the inheritance, yes, those were victories, but they weren't the true victory. The true victory was the woman I had become in the process. I no longer felt the gnawing ache of humiliation. I no longer craved an explanation or an apology. What I felt instead was peace, the kind that comes when you finally set down a weight you should never have carried in the first place. I walked through each room of the house that evening, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories embedded in every corner. The family photos still hung in the hallway, but now I looked at them differently. Not with sadness for what was lost, but with gratitude for what I had built, for the children I had raised, for the love I had poured into this place. That love was still here. It had never belonged to him alone. In the living room, I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, the divorce papers resting on the table beside me. His signature stared back at me, jagged and rushed, the symbol of his downfall. My own name sat steady, deliberate, a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it waits. I thought of him then, of the panic in his eyes when he realized what he had lost, of the mistress who would soon see him for who he truly was. I didn't need to chase revenge. It was already unfolding, not by my hand, but by his own. And for the first time in decades, I felt free. The rain outside softened into a gentle drizzle. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the quiet wrap around me. No shouting, no accusations, no betrayal echoing through the halls. Just peace. I knew life would not be simple from here. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt. But I also knew I had faced the worst and survived. More than survived, I had endured with dignity, and I had won my freedom without ever needing to lower myself to his level. That night, as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, I am enough. I always was. And I believed it. Slow, fade out, emotional, close, 250 words. Sometimes we measure our worth in the wrong places, in the love we receive, in the validation of others, in the promises that are so easily broken. But betrayal has a way of stripping everything bare, forcing you to see yourself not through someone else's eyes, but through your own. He thought leaving me would diminish me. He thought discarding me would erase me. But, in truth, it only revealed me. I am not the woman he tried to reduce me to. I am not the silence he mistook for weakness. I am not the shadow he thought would fade when he turned away. I am strength. I am resilience. I am the proof that dignity can outlast betrayal. And as I sit here now, watching the rain fade into a clear night, I realize that his story, no longer matters to me. What matters is mine, and I will write the rest of it on my own terms. So tell me, have you ever carried a betrayal so heavy, it almost broke you only to find it shaped you instead? Would you forgive? Or would you let silence deliver the justice? Comment below to share your thoughts. And if my story touched you, subscribe to Grace's Truth because sometimes the quietest voices hold the most powerful truths.